जिंदाबाद अपनी MSO जिंदाबाद 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 अपनी
took root in Europe. The idea becomes really problematic when we move out of Europe. And today in Europe too, it becomes really, really problematic as people from North Africa, people from Syria starts arriving in Europe. The idea of white nationalism and Western nationalism gets challenged. So all this rhetoric about Europe being secular comes under threat and gets challenged. Europe has always been priding itself to be very secular, to be very open, to be very accommodative. But today it's under threat. Why? Because people who look different, people who have a different belief system pose a threat to the idea of French nationality, British nationality, Belgian nationality. After all, what is this nation if not homogeneity? Right? That's how they have believed nation to be what they are. So when the nation comes under threat, the idea of nation and nationality comes under threat, then the idea of secularism is challenged. It's under the contradiction emerges. It's the same with the United States. United States is a very open society, a very receptive society. And the challenge is not new. Even in the early 20th century, and I'm talking about 1925, 1930, when the first group of Catholics from Ireland started migrating into the United States, the Calvinists were really threatened. And they were really threatened by the Catholics. The Irish was seen as being very, very problematic. They drank a different kind of alcohol. The Calvinists felt that, the Catholics drank too much beer and partied too hard and laughed too loudly. And it was an affront, an assault on the Calvinist culture, who were very, very reserved as compared to the Catholics, the Irish Catholics. So you see the emergence of racism even in the 1920s. So nationalism and secularism comes under threat at that point of time too. So there's a constant threat going on. So we see this challenge to nation and nationalism in the West at that point of time as well. Now come to India, it becomes even more complicated. India is an imagined community. Every state in India is like a nation in Europe. What is common between someone in Tamil Nadu and someone living in Kashmir? Can you imagine someone from Kerala going and giving up his life fighting for a piece of land in Ladakh where his family will never go to, with which he has no affinity? Why? Because in school he has been taught that that land belongs to sacred India, and India, which is drawn in a map, is sacrosanct to him or her. So it's an imagined community. It's created through imagination, through schooling system, through universities, through televisions, through movies. It's inculcated. It's not real. Nations have had a role. Nations are embedded in contradictions. for a post-colonial country, for a country which was colonized for more than 200 years or so, the idea of nation in South Asia helped people of South Asia get rid of exploitation. People of South Asia were plundered. Millions of people died because their food was taken away. We had famines after famines under colonialism. We became food insufficient. So the idea of being one nation helped us fight a unified resistance. The idea of one nation also helped in creating a unified non-aligned system to resist exploitation by superpowers. But, nations, the idea of nation is overrated. People kill in the name of nations. It creates division. It divides human beings. Millions of people were killed during the World War. Why? Because people fought in the name of nations. So somehow I believe nations, the idea of nations as an imagined community is overrated. And in India, particularly, where there are so many fragments, so many states which are different from one another, it creates a strange challenge to unite it as one nation and create this imagination that we are all one. But, in order to create this nation as one nation, very many centripetal and centrifugal forces operate at the same point of time. For those of you who are familiar with physics would immediately understand what I mean. For those of you who are not, sort of forgotten your 10th grade physics, just to remind you, there are certain forces that are sort of pulling us in, keeping us together, and there are certain forces that are trying to pull us apart. Okay, centripetal are forces that are trying to keep us together, and centrifugal are those that are sort of take us apart. So these forces have always operated on us through time. And if you were to think about, South Asia, are there uniting forces in South Asia? Has there ever been forces that have united South Asia? What is common to South Asia? And you could dig up very many ideas that you would think unite South Asia. Then some of the things that would come to your mind is, did mythology unite South Asia? For example, Ramayana. But then you would know, that the way Ramayana was interpreted in one part of India was very different from another part of India. The Ramayana of, Uttar Pradesh, what is Uttar Pradesh today, 700, 800 years, 500 years ago, was very different in Tamil Nadu. Tamil Nadu's Ramayana is very different from Uttar Pradesh's. So is it a centripetal force? It's only today that we think of Ramayana as a, single kind of Ramayana. So what is it that united the region as one? And one force that you could think that united the region as one was, you could say, the caste system. Maybe the caste system united South Asia as one region. But even that is a little bit problematic. You could say that the Varna system of, untouchability and Brahmins, but a Brahmin of Bihar would not marry a Brahmin of Bengal or of Maharashtra. Even if we sort of forget or think of South Asia before the arrival of the Muslims. Everyone arrived in India. No one is indigenous, We are all from Africa. So everyone arrived at some point of time or the other. So is caste a unifying force? Maybe. But caste itself was looked upon very differently from one region to another. So there are very few centripetal forces that could unite India as one common time thread. So given that there were very few common forces that could tie India as one, hence the empires that came into existence in India, which expanded and contracted. So for example, Ashoka's empire that expanded, the Mauryan empire that expanded, or for that matter, the Mughal empire that expanded, is what tied India at different points of time in history, created what you could say unified South Asia, if any. And then the British arrived and they colonized India. The first war of independence took place in 1857. The British called it a mutiny. Karl Marx called it the First War of Independence. Many of us call it the First War of Independence. I call it the First War of Independence. But in any case, in 1857, we fought the First War of Independence. I think this is really important in order to understand how the idea of secularism sort of followed after this. What happened to secularism in India after this? So in 1871, British India instituted something called the census. And for the first time in 1871, the British instituted a category called Hindu as a religion. The Supreme Court has said that Hinduism is a way of life. Hinduism was always a way of life. Hindus are people who live across the river Sindhu. Hindu was never a religion. You have to remember that. The religion is something else. Not everyone had access to the Vedas. Only the twice born had access to the Vedas. Only the upper caste had access to the Vedas. And that too, religion was followed differently across the entire South Asia region. So there was nothing called the Hindu religion. Hinduism was always a way of life. It is the British who created what is called Hinduism only to ensure that they were not challenged. They wanted to create a category because in 1857, everyone wanted to unite under the Mughal ruler to throw the British out. So the British wanted to create a category of people who would be a unit in itself and would be divided against the Mughal. So if the Muslims and the so-called new category that they were creating, Hindus, would fight amongst themselves, then the British would be free to rule the country. So the category Hindu itself was created to divide and rule India. And that was the purpose for which this entire category was created. You have to remember that, the Shudras, who are now known as the OBCs, were not even allowed in the temple. So they were not accepted as Hindus. What is now understood as Hindus. The scheduled castes were not acceptable at one point of time. They were called the untouchables. So this was a new category of integrating and creating a larger block. to create fissures in the South Asian society. But in any case, we attained independence in 1947, and the country ended up being divided by because of this fissure, because of this division that had been created.